On the night of July 16, 1918, in a cramped basement in the Ural Mountains, Tsar Nicholas II stood with his family for the last time. The walls were bare, the air was thick with fear. Just decades earlier, his ancestors had ruled from golden halls that stretched longer than football fields, where chandeliers held thousands of candles and ceilings were painted by the greatest artists in Europe. Now, the last Romanov emperor faced a firing squad in a room barely large enough to hold them all. 304 years of imperial power, built on palaces that rivaled the gods, ended in a single blood-soaked night. This is the story of how the most opulent dynasty in history built monuments to their own invincibility, and how those very palaces blinded them to the revolution that would consume them whole. The Romanov dynasty didn't begin with grandeur. It began with survival. In 1613, Russia was drowning in chaos. The previous royal line had collapsed. Foreign armies occupied Moscow. Famine ravaged the countryside. The nobility gathered in desperation and chose a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov to be Tsar, not because he was powerful, but because he was weak. They thought they could control him. They were wrong. Mikhail and his successors transformed Russia from a fractured, backward state into one of the great empires of the world. But they didn't just build an empire through conquest and diplomacy. They built it through architecture, through palaces so magnificent that anyone who entered them would understand one thing immediately. The Romanovs were not merely rulers, they were touched by divine power itself. The message was intentional. In a nation where most people lived in wooden huts and dirt floors, the palaces weren't just homes, they were propaganda carved in marble and gold. They whispered to the peasants, to the nobility, to foreign ambassadors, "This power is eternal. This throne cannot fall." But propaganda, no matter how beautiful, is still a lie. Let's begin with Peter the Great, the Tsar who refused to let Russia remain in the shadows of Europe. In 1703, Peter decided to build a new capital from nothing. He chose a swamp on the edge of the Baltic Sea, a place so harsh that thousands of workers died digging its foundations. He called it St. Petersburg, and he designed it to be Russia's window to the West. No more wooden Kremlin fortresses, no more medieval isolation. Peter wanted Baroque splendor. He wanted Europe to see Russia as an equal. And at the heart of this new city, he built the Winter Palace. Actually, that's not quite right. Peter built the first Winter Palace, a modest structure by royal standards. But his daughter, Empress Elizabeth, had bigger dreams. In 1754, she hired the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli and gave him a simple instruction: make it the most magnificent palace on earth. Rastrelli delivered.
The Winter Palace became a sprawling masterpiece of Baroque excess. Over 1,000 rooms, walls painted in turquoise and white, trimmed with gold leaf that shimmered in the northern sun. The grand staircase alone was designed to humble visitors before they even met the Empress. A cascade of white marble and gilded columns that seemed to ascend into heaven itself. Inside, the throne room glittered with so much gold that foreign diplomats wrote home in disbelief. The ballrooms could hold thousands. The art collection grew so vast it would eventually become the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest repositories of human culture in the world. But here's what most people don't realize. The Winter Palace wasn't just beautiful, it was a fortress of isolation. The Romanovs didn't live among their people. They lived above them, separated by gates and guards and an entire world of privilege that most Russians would never glimpse. Peasants froze in the streets outside, while inside, courtiers danced until dawn under crystal chandeliers. The Tsars could look out from their gilded windows and never truly see the suffering below. This disconnect wasn't an accident, it was a feature. By the 19th century, the Romanovs had built an entire constellation of palaces, each more extravagant than the last. There was Peterhof, the Russian Versailles, with its fountains that shot water higher than cathedral spires. Peter the Great had designed it to rival Louis XIV's palace in France, and in many ways it succeeded. The Grand Cascade alone featured over 60 fountains and more than 200 bronze sculptures covered in gold. When the water danced in the summer sun, it looked like liquid fire. Then there was the Catherine Palace, named after Peter's wife. Its facade stretched over 1,000 feet, painted in vivid blue and white, with enough gold decoration to bankrupt a small kingdom. Inside, the legendary Amber Room gleamed, an entire chamber paneled with 6 tons of amber, backed with gold leaf and mirrors. It was called the 8th Wonder of the World. Nazi soldiers would later steal it during World War II, and to this day, it's never been fully recovered. And finally, there was the Alexander Palace, built for Tsar Alexander I, but forever associated with Nicholas II. Unlike the bombastic grandeur of the other palaces, Alexander Palace was almost intimate. Nicholas loved it because it felt like a home, not a museum. It was here, in these quieter halls, that he and his wife Alexandra raised their 5 children. It was here they felt safe. It was also here that their false sense of security would prove fatal.
Nicholas II became Tsar in 1894, and from the very beginning, he was unprepared. His father, Alexander III, had been a giant of a man, physically imposing, politically ruthless, and utterly convinced of the divine right of kings. He had raised Nicholas to believe the same thing, that the Tsar's power came from God, and that any challenge to it was not just treason, but blasphemy. But Nicholas wasn't his father. He was gentle, devoted to his family, and deeply uncomfortable with the brutality required to hold absolute power over 150 million people. He once wrote in his diary that he felt like a prisoner of his own throne. And yet, he refused to share that power. He refused to modernize. He refused to listen when advisors warned him that Russia was changing, that the people were starving, that revolution was simmering beneath the surface like lava under ice. Instead, Nicholas retreated further into his palaces. He and Alexandra, a German princess who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy, became obsessed with mysticism and faith. When their only son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a condition that meant even a small bruise could kill him, they fell under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a wandering holy man who somehow managed to stop the boy's bleeding. Rasputin became a fixture at court, and his presence scandalized the nobility. Rumors swirled that he was manipulating the Tsarina, that he was corrupt, that he held dark power over the royal family. Whether or not the rumors were true didn't matter. What mattered was that the people believed them. And with every passing year, the gap between the Romanovs and their subjects widened. In 1905, that gap exploded into violence. Thousands of workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar. They weren't revolutionaries, not yet. They were loyal subjects, begging their father Tsar to hear their grievances. They sang hymns as they walked through the snow. The Imperial Guard opened fire. Hundreds died. The snow outside the Winter Palace turned red. The day became known as Bloody Sunday, and it shattered the myth that the Tsar cared for his people. Nicholas wasn't even in the city when it happened, but it didn't matter. In the eyes of the public, he had given the order. Nicholas made concessions. He created a parliament called the Duma. He allowed limited freedoms, but he never truly let go of power. and he never truly understood that the world he had inherited was dying. Then came World War I.
Russia entered the war in 1914 with outdated weapons, corrupt leadership, and an army of peasants who didn't understand why they were fighting. Millions died, supply lines collapsed, soldiers starved, and while the country bled, Nicholas made a catastrophic decision. He took personal command of the army and left the government in the hands of Alexandra and Rasputin. It was a disaster. Alexandra, isolated in the Alexander Palace, issued orders based on Rasputin's advice. She dismissed competent ministers and replaced them with loyalists. The government became paralyzed. Meanwhile, Rasputin's behavior grew more erratic. He drank, he boasted, he flaunted his influence. In December 1916, a group of nobles decided enough was enough. They lured Rasputin to a palace, poisoned him, shot him, beat him, and finally drowned him in the icy Neva River. Even then, rumors claimed he was still alive when they threw him in. But killing Rasputin didn't save the Romanovs. By then, it was far too late. In February 1917, bread riots erupted in St. Petersburg. Workers walked off their jobs. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. Within days, the entire city was in open revolt. Nicholas, still at military headquarters hundreds of miles away, didn't grasp the severity. He tried to return to the Alexander Palace to be with his family, but his train was stopped. The rails were controlled by revolutionaries. On March 15, 1917, in a railway car in the middle of nowhere, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended not by a battle, but with a signature on a piece of paper. The family was placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace. For months they lived in a strange limbo, still surrounded by servants and guards, but no longer rulers. Nicholas chopped wood. Alexandra cared for Alexei. The children read and played games. They clung to the hope that maybe, somehow, they would be allowed to leave Russia. Maybe England would take them in. Maybe they could live quietly, somewhere far away. But the revolutionaries had other plans. In August 1917, the family was moved to Tobolsk, a remote town in Siberia. Then, in the spring of 1918, as civil war engulfed Russia, they were transferred again, this time to Yekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains. They were imprisoned in a house that had been commandeered from a wealthy merchant. The windows were whitewashed so they couldn't see out. Guards watched them constantly. The conditions grew harsher, the food grew worse. The outside world slipped further and further away. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family was woken and told they needed to move to the basement for their safety. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 loyal servants gathered in a small room. They waited. Then the executioners entered. They read a brief statement. The Ural Soviet had decided the Romanovs must die. Nicholas barely had time to say what before the shooting began. It was chaos. The room filled with smoke. Bullets ricocheted off the jewels the daughters had sewn into their corsets as a desperate attempt to save the family wealth. The killers had to finish the job with bayonets. When it was over, the bodies were taken into the forest, doused in acid, and buried in unmarked graves. For decades, the location remained a secret. It wasn't until 1991 that the remains were finally discovered and identified. So what do we make of the Romanovs and their cursed palaces? On one hand, they built some of the most breathtaking monuments to human ambition ever created. The Winter Palace, Peterhof, the Catherine Palace. These structures still stand today and millions visit them every year, marveling at their beauty. But those palaces also symbolize everything that went wrong. They were monuments to disconnection, to an imperial family so cocooned in luxury that they couldn't see the storm gathering outside their gates. The Romanovs believed their palaces made them untouchable. In reality, those palaces became their gilded cage. History is full of rulers who mistook grandeur for strength.
The Romanovs are perhaps the most tragic example. They built a world so beautiful, they forgot it was built on suffering. And when the suffering became too great, that world didn't just crumble, it drowned in blood. Today you can walk through those palaces. You can stand in the throne room where czars once commanded armies. You can gaze at the Amber Room, painstakingly reconstructed after the war. You can climb the grand staircase and imagine the glittering balls and whispered conspiracies. But if you listen closely, you might also hear the echo of footsteps in a basement. The sound of a family that thought their power would last forever, learning in the cruelest way possible that nothing does. If stories like this fascinate you, tales of power, ambition, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe. There are so many forgotten chapters left to uncover, and we're just getting started. Thanks for watching.